of you who are new to our conversations, my name is Faye Charpentier, and I should turn my video back on for a moment. My name is Faye Charpentier, and I'm the Program Director at King's Chapel, and I'll be doing our presentation tonight, and then we'll be able to have time for conversation and discussion a little bit later on. So tonight we'll be exploring King's Chapel's religious revolution and taking a deep dive into the church's history in the 1780s under the leadership of James Freeman. So since the church's founding in 1686, King's Chapel has held a unique position in Boston's religious landscape. From New England's first Anglican Church to America's first Unitarian Christian Church, King's Chapel's community has evolved alongside the growth of Boston, reflecting the beliefs and values of the people in an ever-changing city. So as we've taken a closer look at in recent weeks, during the American Revolution, Anglican ministers throughout the American colonies were put in many compromising positions as representatives of a faith so deeply interwoven with British royal authority. Many Anglican ministers left the colonies during the war, leaving their congregations without spiritual leadership. At King's Chapel, in the 1776 departure of Reverend Henry Kaner, who's pictured here on the left of the screen, within the first year of the war, paved the way for a revolution within the church under the dynamic leadership of a young, unordained man, James Freeman, who's pictured on the right. By 1787, in some ways to the dismay of the emerging American Episcopal Church, King's Chapel ordained James Freeman as their minister in a lay-led ceremony, becoming America's first Unitarian Church and laying the groundwork for the emergence of the Unitarian Church in the United States. Because a decent portion of the history we'll be dealing with tonight deals directly with King's Chapel's revisions to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer as the basis of their liturgy, I do think it's important to spend a little bit of time getting a grasp of what this text is and how it came into creation. So we're going to take a little bit of a look at kind of the Anglican history before moving forward. So when King's Chapel was established in 1686, it carried with it nearly 150 years of tradition within England's state church. So Anglicanism, or the Church of England, initially emerged under the reign of King Henry VIII, pictured on the left, who, with the Act of Supremacy in 1534, declared England's religious independence. The Act declared Henry VIII as the supreme head of the Church of England, which effectively broke ties between England and the Vatican and the Roman Catholic establishment. The Book of Common Prayer, introduced as the communal liturgy to be used across all churches of England, came into being shortly after the formation of the Anglican Church. To lead his new faith, Henry VIII appointed an archbishop to oversee the Anglican Church, utilizing the prior Catholic network of bishops and parish churches to organize the English Church. Thomas Cranmer, who is pictured in the center of your screen, was appointed as the first Protestant Archbishop of Canterbury and given the task of establishing precedents for worship in the new denomination. In 1549, so 15 years after Henry VIII declared himself the head of the church, Archbishop Cranmer drafted a centralized liturgy during the reign of King Edward VI. In England, the Book of Common Prayer, which was the text Cranmer produced, made literate worshipers more active participants in their faith, as they could now access the fundamental text of their religion and liturgy that had been previously rare and expensive. The Act of Uniformity in 1552 made all services in Cranmer's prayer book the only style that could be used for public worship in England. Penalties for non-compliance ranged from fines to life imprisonment. However, the following year, Queen Mary I, a devout Roman Catholic, ascended to the English throne. She restored Catholic worship throughout England, banned the use of Cranmer's prayer book, and executed supporters of the Anglican faith, including Thomas Cranmer, who was unfortunately burned at the stake during her reign. After her short but violent reign, Queen Mary I, Queen Elizabeth I, pictured on the right, who ruled from 1558 to 1603, restored use of the prayer book. The prayer book was modestly revised in 1662, and this version became the standard use in England and her colonies until the time of the American Revolution. And it was during this period of time, at the end of the Revolution, 1782, 1783, that King's Chapel's congregation returned to the stone chapel on the corners of Tremont and School Street, where it still stands today. However, without a minister, the returning church vestryman and new senior warden, Thomas Bulfinch, invited 24-year-old James Freeman to lead the congregation as a lay reader, or lay person able to preach and conduct some religious services, but not licensed to celebrate the communion or officiate marriages, baptisms, until the church would be able to find an ordained minister. Before we move a little bit forward, I'll just point out that we're looking now again at Reverend Henry Kaner, King's Chapel's last Anglican minister, who some of you may have seen this image before of his last entry in the King's Chapel Register of Marriages in 1776, where he describes the circumstances under which he left Boston at the start of, or early on in the American Revolution. So in September of 1782, after the congregation is ultimately moving back to King's Chapel, following a stint of several years worshiping alongside Trinity Church, who was led by the man on the left at the time, Reverend Samuel Parker, the church leadership brought James Freeman aboard in September 1782 to, quote, officiate in the capacity of reader for 6 months, and was expected to read the service twice every Sunday and also on Saints' days. And he was initially paid £50 sterling for his work, and after 6 months was officially named pastor, and his salary was raised to £200 annually. So what we're looking at the screen here is essentially James Freeman's letter of hire, which is presented to him by Thomas Bulfinch and James Ivers, who are the church wardens or lay leaders of the congregation at that time. And James Freeman kind of gets the basis of what his duties would be from this letter. So in addition to conducting services, there is the section that we did talk about last week, if some of you were with us last time, which I've highlighted again in a red box. Freeman was also asked to preach with, quote, the alterations in the service as are made by Reverend Mr. Parker, which Bulfinch and other congregants would have heard during their years at Trinity Church. And also, quote, leave the use of the Athanasian Creed at your discretion. The Athanasian Creed focuses on Trinitarian doctrine and theology. So this is an early indication of James Freeman's discomfort with Trinitarian language and that aspect of Christian theology, which he would ultimately make changes to within his own church. So as Freeman began preaching at King's Chapel, he would use that discretion to change the liturgy even further than done by Reverend Parker. So remember, the initial changes made by Reverend Parker and other Anglican ministers during the American Revolution was essentially just altering references to the monarchy and the royal family and replacing them with prayers for Congress, the president, and things like that. So taking it out of that British royal context. But Freeman's personal faith had shifted, and he would begin to have further doubts about one of the foundational aspects of the church he was now working aboard, which was, again, the Trinity. When James Freeman came to King's Chapel, he began to share his personal ideology and some of his theological ideas with the congregation. But as we see, but before he's even hired, we know that he's having conversations about that with the wardens based on their inclusion, that he's able to omit the Athanasian Creed if he does choose so. But Freeman, as a young man and in his early time at King's Chapel, held Armenian beliefs, And Arminianism was a Dutch form of Protestantism related to Calvinism, and his beliefs under that kind of system included that human beings were born with freedom and reason, and the belief that Jesus was semi-angelic but was not the same as God. And he did not believe priests or various people in different hierarchies of the church had the power to absolve people of sin, nor did sacraments. Freeman eventually, later on in his life, would come to the conclusion that for him personally, he didn't believe that Jesus was divine on his journey towards becoming a Unitarian. The idea of the Holy Trinity, as I said, did not sit well with Freeman, and he began to discuss this with others and included it in his early sermons at King's Chapel. And ultimately, this rejection of the Holy Trinity and the changes he and the lay leadership would make to King's Chapel's liturgy would eventually become a sticking point in his attempts for episcopal ordination. But to look a little bit further at James Freeman as a young man and prior to arriving at King's Chapel, although he, again, was 24 when he was hired, so still at a young age. James Freeman grew up attending the sermons of Congregationalist minister Charles Chauncey, who is pictured on the right side of your screen, who preached often of God's benevolence and that people should be good not because of the threat of punishment, but in order to be happy and live fulfilled lives. During Freeman's time at Harvard College, he would have been reading the same Enlightenment philosophers that inspired American revolutionary thought, including John Locke, who believed that people were born as blank slates, neither good nor evil, and John Locke was a major influence on Freeman. Freeman was also exposed to Enlightenment Christianity, which at the time was stressing the freedom and goodness of people, as well as ethics. And he also encountered writings of people we would often consider founding fathers of the United States, like Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and other prominent revolutionary thinkers like Benjamin Franklin. All of these influenced Freeman to kind of think beyond the accepted Anglican liturgy that he was presented with and opened him up to other ways of thinking about Christianity. But perhaps the largest influences on Freeman's theological thought were that of Theophilus Lindsay and Samuel Clarke, two Anglican ministers who developed anti-Trinitarian prayer books in the 18th century England. We know that Freeman, later in his time at King's Chapel, had correspondence with Lindsay and wrote about his personal theology and struggles with the Anglican liturgy in that correspondence. And the changes that Freeman would make to the King's Chapel prayer book were modeled after what Lindsay had done about a decade earlier. As I mentioned before, as Freeman grew less comfortable with the Anglican liturgy at King's Chapel in his position at lay reader, his personal views were at odds with the doctrine of the church he was hired to conduct services for. Reverend William Hazlitt, a member of Lindsay's congregation who had recently moved to Boston, befriended Freeman and encouraged him, whether directly or indirectly, to change the liturgy within the church. And after preaching about his Reformed theology for a couple years, Freeman met with the proprietors of King's Chapel, or the pew owners, to discuss making changes to this liturgy in the spring of 1787. The committee sympathized with Freeman's desires, but urged smaller changes. And Freeman hoped that he would be able to make further changes within the prayer book in future years. So when James Freeman and the members of the church set out to amend their liturgy, they followed in the steps, as I said, and took inspiration from Anglican clergy in England. Theologians in the Church of England had been keen on reforming the church's Book of Common Prayer at various points in the previous century. And again, these two main influences on his work were Samuel Clarke and Theophilus Lindsay. So this is a portrait of Samuel Clarke here. Anglican minister Samuel Clarke began the process of radically editing the Book of Common Prayer in the early 1700s. His work challenged the Trinitarian doctrine, or the doctrine of the Trinity, which was a predecessor to the Unitarian theology championed by James Freeman at King's Chapel. During his career, Clarke had served as a chaplain to Queen Anne and as the rector of St. James Church in Piccadilly. But despite his notable career, Clarke was censured by the Church of England for views expressed in a 1712 book he wrote entitled On the Scripture Doctrine of the Trinity. Along with other Arian Anglicans, Clarke, quote, questioned the Trinity, emphasized the human capacity to do good, and believed that the Bible, if read with reason as well as faith, was a significant rule for Christian belief and practice. Although Clarke publicly agreed to denounce his work and no longer publish on anti-Trinitarian thought, he secretly reformed a copy of his prayer book, in which he altered all references to the Trinity, leaving only those that were quoted directly from Scripture. In his work, he also only used texts which discussed God, excluding those with interpretations of the Trinity, and introduced doxologies in God's name, or rather liturgical words or actions to denote a brief act of praise. Later, James Freeman at King's Chapel would do the same in their own Book of Common Prayer, altering interpretations of the Trinity to those that only refer to God. And then we have Theophilus Lindsay, who you are now looking at your screens. Theophilus Lindsay was an English contemporary of James Freeman, who put Clarke's reforms into practice in the 1770s and really paved the way for Freeman's reforms in the King's Chapel prayer book edits. In 1773, while visiting a friend on his way to London, where he was going to be starting his own independent church, Lindsay was shown a copy of Samuel Clarke's prayer book. According to former King's Chapel minister, Reverend Carl Scoville, Lindsay realized that Clarke's non-Trinitarian prayer book was the very model that he needed for creating his own prayer book. After adding additional reforms and more radical changes to the text, Lindsay established a congregation on London's Essex Street, founding England's first Unitarian congregation. Shortly after James Freeman was hired at King's Chapel, as I mentioned before, a member of Lindsay's church, William Hazlitt, came to America. And through Hazlitt, Freeman learned of Clarke and Lindsay's prayer books. Freeman expressed early praise of Hazlitt, writing, quote, before Hazlitt came to Boston, the Trinitarian doxology was almost universally used. That honest good man prevailed upon several respectable ministers to omit it. And of course, James Freeman himself would soon become one of these ministers. So in taking his position leading King's Chapel's congregation, James Freeman undertook two monumental tasks in his 20s. First, he would work with the church wardens in church vestry on revising the Book of Common Prayer, as was happening more broadly in the new Episcopal Church, but as I said, mostly in terms of kind of breaking those ties with the monarchy and British rule. The second task would make the first of all the more difficult. That was adapting the prayer book to reconcile with his own theological beliefs. So for Freeman to continue working at King's Chapel, the prayer book would need to emphasize individual interpretations of Scripture and remove these non-biblical mentions of the Trinity. Post-revolutionary America, in the transition from Anglican to Episcopal, he saw as the perfect opportunity to attempt to make significant changes to the Book of Common Prayer. What we're looking at the screen here are a couple hand-edited pages from the 1785 work by King's Chapel to revise their prayer book. So on the left side, we see an instance where a prayer for the royal family has been crossed out. And on the right side, we see some areas, again, with these kind of political prayers, but also these examples of crossing out sections, literally cutting and pasting and adding new sections in. So as I mentioned a little earlier, in offering Freeman the position of lay reader, the congregation of King's Chapel allowed him a measure of freedom in how he performed services. Freeman's letters reveal his optimism for liturgical and theological change during his early years. In a letter to his father, James Freeman wrote, "For the proprietors of the chapel are very liberal in their notions. They allow me to make several alterations in the service, which liberty I frequently use. We can scarcely be called of the Church of England. It seems to be the intention of the Episcopalians here to form an American church." And it should be noted that the edits made to the prayer book at King's Chapel in the 1780s were not solely under the control of James Freeman, and not all the proposed changes he made were approved. The process, again, was a collaboration with other members of the church leadership, and all changes would ultimately need to be approved by the congregation at large, which they did by vote mere months after they first started incorporating and trying out trial runs of the new liturgy. Freeman noted that, quote, of about 90 families of which the congregation consists, 15 only are opposed to the Reformation, in reference to the changes to the prayer book. So what are some of these changes made by Freeman in King's Chapel to the Book of Common Prayer by the Prayer Book Committee? In a letter from 1785, again, Freeman notes some of these revisions that take us from, on the left, early 1700s version of the Book of Common Prayer, which is held in the collection of King's Chapel, to the kind of title page of the 1785 King's Chapel Prayer Book, which was the first edition. So describing some of these changes, he talks about, you will perceive that the Athanasian Creed is omitted, the Nicene Creed and the 39 Articles are also left out, the baptismal service is made almost entirely new, and the communion, burial, and other services corrected in many particulars. The Reformation is not so perfect as I could wish, but much is done and more than I ever expected. So what's interesting to note here is that the Nicene Creed wasn't fully removed from the prayer book until a slightly later edition, but this was, of course, a change that Freeman was hoping to have made earlier on. James Freeman's legacy can still be seen in the Book of Common Prayer today at King's Chapel. The current 9th edition is still largely based on the 1785 version and retains a reproduction of the original 1785 preference, which remains one of our best insights into Freeman's intent with his work on the text. So while King's Chapel became the first independent Unitarian congregation in America, King's Chapel at the time tried their best to consider themselves the first Episcopal church in Boston for a time, which we can see in how they laid out their title page, referring to themselves quite literally as the first Episcopal church in Boston. What they wrote in the original preface to this prayer book to kind of explain their intentions was, quote, the liturgy contained in this volume is such as no Christian, it is such, can take offense at or find his conscience wounded in repeating. So what they really strived to do was to, in many ways, make this text more open to individual interpretation. So containing and retaining aspects of the tradition from the Anglican Church, but also kind of adding a little bit more flexibility for people to kind of read through their own eyes. But amending the prayer book for King's Chapel proved a relatively easy effort for James Freeman in comparison to the much more daunting task of trying to secure Episcopal ordination. So during his early years as a lay reader at King's Chapel, James Freeman was fairly optimistic about getting ordained. The first step of ordination would be cementing his place within King's Chapel. Freeman carried some anxiety early on about the congregation's response to his theology, but after receiving encouragement and kind of positive feedback to his sermons and explaining his beliefs and kind of entering in discussion with them, he kind of grew into it, came into his own and became more confident in his role in the church. Even after his success with revising the King's Chapel liturgy and ongoing support from the majority of his own church's membership, James Freeman still remained unordained. Practically, as I mentioned earlier, this meant that he did not have the authority to perform certain religious rites, including marriages, funerals, certain prayers, communion, things like that. For his career to continue at King's Chapel, the church leadership pursued Freeman's ordination. And it was, as I said, a complicated path. And they discussed several avenues for his ordination and sought out prospective candidates to perform the ceremony. Freeman was never a supporter of the hierarchical and administrative structure within the Church of England. He saw the American Republic as a time and place for opportunity to adopt new structures for individual church organization. He wrote to his father again, expressing his hopes about ordination at this time and about his the church, but his view on the structure, saying, quote, "I like the liturgy of the Church of England, but I'm fond of independent form of ecclesiastical government." The first choice for ordination in the traditional kind of Anglican structure, which is how earlier colonial Anglican ministers in American colonies would have been ordained, would be to go to England and be ordained by an Anglican bishop. And as I said, that would have been the norm prior to the Revolution. But Freeman quickly put that option to rest, saying, quote, "To go to England for them would be pleasant enough, but base and servile for a free republican." So again, stressing those political tensions within the church at that time. The next logical step was to have Freeman ordained by a clergyman who were themselves ordained in the Anglican Church. And two prominent individuals sought out by the King's Chapel were the Bishop Samuel Seabury, who's pictured on your screen now, as well as Reverend Samuel Provost, who had also become an early American Episcopal bishop. So Samuel Seabury was in fact the first American Episcopal bishop who was based in Connecticut. Freeman and the church wardens of King's Chapel wrote to Bishop Seabury and even sent him a copy of King's Chapel's new revised liturgy. When Seabury was visiting Boston, he agreed for a meeting with Freeman, and the meeting unfortunately did not bode well for his ordination chances. Freeman wrote of the meeting, quote, my visit to Bishop Seabury terminated as I expected. Before I was waited upon, he gave out that he would never ordain me, but it was necessary to ask the question. Seabury agreed to ordain Freeman if and only if all the Connecticut clergymen approved. So Freeman did go to Connecticut to meet with these clergymen and try to make his case. But his letters recount that the meeting, which he describes in detail, can be summed up with further rejection based on Freeman's admission at the time that, quote, there are some parts of the Book of Common Prayer that I do not approve of. So after kind of this rejection from Samuel Seabury, who is of course a very influential voice in the emerging Episcopal Church in America, King's Chapel reaches out to Reverend Samuel Provost in New York. So what you're seeing on the screen here is a letter written by Senior Warden Thomas Bulfinch, who's pictured right here, and then Samuel Provost is in the bottom right-hand corner. While they were initially in agreement about King's Chapel's revised liturgy, Provost was skeptical about ordaining Freeman. He would bring up the question of ordination to the upcoming convention of American Episcopal leaders, but that actually wouldn't end up being scheduled to take place until 1789. At their meeting between Provost and Freeman, Freeman's outlook on ordination from an Episcopal bishop became less hopeful, and he began to seriously consider the option of lay ordination. After the meeting, Freeman ended up writing, quote, should Provost refuse to ordain me, I shall endeavor to effect a plan which I have long had in my head, which is to be ordained by the congregational ministers of this town, or to preach and administer the ordinances without any ordination. The last scheme I most approve of. The wardens again contacted Samuel Provost, but reached no conclusion. With all previous efforts of ordination seemingly stuck in limbo, Freeman and the wardens of King's Chapel presented the lay ordination option to the congregation. In 1787, King's Chapel charged forward with their plans of ordaining James Freeman on their own terms without the presence of clergy. As I said, despite these hopeful conversations with Reverend Provost, who was more kind of open to Freeman and King's Chapel's situation than Samuel Seabury was, the congregation, and namely James Freeman, were unwilling to wait until that topic could be discussed at the upcoming convention. And rather than risk not being fully accepted into the Episcopal Church at a later date, if they pursued ordination with the incorporation of clergy from another denomination, such as the Congregationalists, King's Chapel ended up opting for another route, lay ordination by vote. It was an idea that the church discovered was actually protected through the language of the 1780 Massachusetts Constitution and Declaration of Rights. So on the screen here, this is the opening of the Declaration of Rights from the Massachusetts Constitution, and explained very simply by Reverend Carl Scoville, quote, "In defense of this mode of ordination, the ordaining committee appealed to Scripture, the practice of the early church, and the Republican principles of the new nation." The third article of the Massachusetts Constitution and Declaration of Rights offered the following protection of religious practice in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. The several towns, parishes, precincts, and other bodies politic or religious societies shall at all times have the exclusive right of electing their public teachers and of contracting with them for their support and maintenance. This style with election was first utilized by King's Chapel at James Freeman's ordination in 1787, and each subsequent ordination since then has continued in this tradition of, quote, "by the virtue of the Constitution and laws of this Commonwealth," as being a part of that ordination ceremony. So in October of 1787, a committee of church members submitted a plan for ordination to the lay leaders of King's Chapel, which was described as to ordain, constitute, and appoint James Freeman to be their minister with full power to preach, baptize, administer the Holy Communion, bury the dead, and perform all the other rites and offices usually performed by a minister in Episcopal orders. Let this vote be entered upon the records of the church. Let it be read in public on some Sunday evening after divine service. Let the members of the church publicly signify their assent to it. And let Mr. Freeman declare that he accepts of this ordination and appointment. And following a long defense of their reasons for opting to kind of pursue this path of lay ordination, as opposed to a more traditional or established route, the leadership and congregation of King's Chapel moved forward with their plans. By the end of November, just a month after this document was presented, their vision came to fruition. In early November, the leadership determined more specifics of their plan for ordination and verified their intents with members. And the ordination was scheduled for November 18th. Just 2 days earlier, though, prior to the ordination, several members of the church submitted a protest expressing, quote, "utter abhorrence of measures so contrary to the doctrine, discipline, and worship of an Episcopal church, representing a total alienation of the property of said house from the use intended by the original funders or donors." Of the 17 people who signed the petition, their names are on the screen in front of you. It was determined that 5 had actually moved out of New England during the American Revolution, and 10 had not worshipped in the chapel for years. So the church leaders, the membership, determined that only 2 active congregants really objected to the ordination. What's interesting about this here is that James Ivers, one of the first signers, you may recall from earlier in tonight's presentation, he was one of the church leaders, the wardens at the time that Freeman was initially hired, which is an interesting dynamic to think about. The other active member is Roselle Apthorpe down here, who is actually the mother-in-law of Thomas Bulfinch, who was the leading lay player in the ordination of James Freeman. But despite these objections, of course, the ordination went forward. And a special service, again on Sunday, November 18th, 1787, conducted by Senior Warman, Dr. Thomas Bulfinch II, who's on the right hand of your screen. He led the congregation in electing James Freeman as their ordained minister. While the intention at the time was not to break free as an independent church, Freeman's ordination sent shockwaves through local and Episcopal religious communities. Immediately after, in the immediate aftermath of James Freeman's ordination, King's Chapel received harsh criticism from area churches and from Episcopal establishment. Despite King's Chapel's intentions, the other churches viewed the ordination as a severing with any established church. Numerous newspaper articles covered the story, expressing shock, disappointment, and even satirical humor towards the church's actions. And soon, even the Episcopal establishment made their thoughts clear. King's Chapel had crossed a line and was not welcome in their communion. In early December 1787, just weeks after Freeman's ordination, local Episcopal clergy in the greater Boston area published the protest on your screen against King's Chapel, which effectively served in their eyes to excommunicate King's Chapel and its members. Highlighted here is a section that I think is very telling of their feelings about this, which I'll read a little bit of it out loud. We, the ministers of the Protestant Episcopal Church, do hereby declare the proceedings of said congregation, usually meeting in the Stone Chapel of Boston, to be irregular, unconstitutional, diametrally opposite to every principle adopted in any Episcopal church, subversive of all order and regularity, and pregnant with consequences fatal to the interests of religion. And we do hereby, and in this public manner, protest against the aforesaid proceedings, to the end that all those of our communion, wherever dispersed, may be cautioned against receiving said reader or preacher James Freeman as a clergyman of our church, or holding communion with him as such, and may be induced to look upon his congregation in the light in which it ought to be looked upon by all true Episcopalians. Among the signers of this document were Reverend Samuel Parker of Trinity Church, who King's Chapel's congregation, less than a decade prior to, was worshiping alongside. And Samuel Parker in some ways served as an early mentor to James Freeman in his time at King's Chapel, and was helping out the church when they needed an ordained minister during his early tenure. We also see the Reverend William Montague, the minister of Christ Church or the Old North Church in Boston. And both Parker and Montague are ministers at daughter churches that actually grew out of King's Chapel's congregation just decades prior. But over time, King's Chapel solidified its separation further in text, solidifying the church's view of a benevolent God, positive outlook on humankind, and removing the Apostles' Creed from their liturgy officially by 1811, and ultimately removing the last of the prayers for Episcopal bishops from the prayer book by 1828. Despite protests and controversy, Freeman soon gained respect as an ordained minister among many churches in Boston, and his assistant ministers and successors would be involved in the broader American Unitarian Church and served as editors and frequent contributors to the major Unitarian publications of the day. King's Chapel's theological revolution in the 1780s paved the path for the growth and expansion of the Unitarian Church in America throughout the 19th century. And I'll point out here, we have young James Freeman on the left and also a portrait of James Freeman in his later years on the right. The congregation that James Freeman inspired in the 18th century remains committed to his memory. King's Chapel is still an active house of worship, home of a vibrant and thoughtful congregation of Unitarian Christians. To this day, they worship each Sunday with a liturgy first introduced to the church in the 1780s by James Freeman. Each prayer book in the chapel, which is pictured on the right, that's the 9th edition currently used by the church today, still contains a copy of his original introduction, expressing the church's, quote, earnest desire to live in brotherly love and peace with all men. A message as resonant in the years following American independence as it is today. The American Revolution and King's Chapel's theological revolution under Freeman's leadership go hand in hand. Their influence can still be experienced at King's Chapel today.